Imagine standing at the edge of a desert cliff on the eastern bank of the Nile, watching a team of archaeologists carefully brush away thousands of years of compacted sand and broken stone, only to find something that quietly dismantles every assumption we had about how human civilization learned to build toward the sky. That is exactly what happened at a site called Jabal al-Tayr in Egypt's Minya Governorate in June 2026. And what they found inside those ancient walls did not just make international headlines. It forced scientists to go back and rethink the entire origin story of the Egyptian pyramid. Not just where it came from, not just when it was first conceived, but who was doing the thinking, and how widely that thinking had already spread before anyone ever built the first step of the first step pyramid. For decades, we thought we had a reasonably clear picture of how the ancient Egyptians arrived at the pyramid. We believed it was a slow but obvious evolution, from the flat-topped mastaba tombs of the earliest dynastic burials to the layered step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, to the perfectly angled true pyramid that still stands at Giza. It felt like a logical progression, almost inevitable in hindsight, as if one idea simply and naturally led to the next. But what the team from Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities uncovered at Jabal al-Tayr threw a significant wrench into that neat, linear story. Two tombs, both dating back to the early dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2686 BC, were sitting quietly beneath the desert surface, and hidden inside their stone walls was a construction technique that nobody expected to find this early in Egyptian history. A technique that changes what we know about when the engineering principles behind the pyramids were first understood. The first thing the team noticed when they began to carefully analyze the physical structure of these tombs was the walls. They were not built the way you would expect a simple burial structure from 5,000 years ago to be built. The walls were deliberately thicker at the base, and gradually became narrower as they rose toward the top. That single architectural decision, the decision to taper a wall from its base upward, is the same fundamental structural principle that makes a pyramid physically possible. It distributes weight more efficiently across a wider foundation. It increases lateral stability. It allows a much taller and heavier structure to stand for thousands of years without collapsing under the pressure of its own mass. The people who built these tombs already understood that concept. They were already applying it in stone in a provincial burial ground in central Egypt, centuries before Imhotep ever stacked the first stone of the step pyramid of Djoser, and centuries before anyone had conceived of building a monument that would reach 40 stories into the sky. Mohammed Abdelbadie, the head of the Egyptian antiquities sector, was one of the first senior officials to speak publicly about the significance of what had been uncovered. He described the first tomb's construction technique as a concept that may represent an early stage in the engineering evolution that eventually led to the step pyramid, and later to the true pyramid form. That is not a casual or minor statement. That is one of Egypt's most senior antiquities officials saying directly and clearly that the intellectual and structural blueprint for one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history was being drafted inside modest burial chambers in the central Egyptian countryside, long before anyone imagined a structure so massive it could be seen from outer space, and long before the civilization that produced it had even reached what we consider its full political or cultural maturity. What made the second tomb equally important to researchers was its physical condition. Situated just south of the first, the second structure mirrors nearly the same architectural plan, but has survived the millennia in far better shape. Archaeologists were able to walk through and study the stonework, the surviving structural reinforcements, and the original layout in a level of detail that is genuinely rare for structures this old. And what they found there reinforced and confirmed everything they had already observed in the first tomb. The same tapering wall construction, the same engineering logic built into the dimensions of the stone, the same early understanding of load distribution and structural equilibrium, all of it sitting there in a remarkably preserved state in a place that most of the world had never heard of, waiting for a team of researchers patient and skilled enough to finally look closely enough to understand exactly what they were seeing and what it meant. Dr. Hisham El-Laythi, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, made an additional connection during his assessment of the site that deepened the significance of the discovery even further. He noted that preliminary studies had revealed a striking architectural resemblance between the Jabal al-Tayr tombs and the famous tomb of King Den at Abydos. King Den was one of the most significant and well-documented rulers of Egypt's first dynasty, a pharaoh whose burial complex has long been studied by archaeologists for what it reveals about the origins of royal power, early ritual practice, and the very first experiments in monumental stone construction. The fact that a burial site located in Minya, a provincial region of central Egypt, far removed from the great royal cemeteries of Upper Egypt, shares architectural DNA with the tomb of a first dynasty king is not simply an interesting coincidence. It is a clue about the structure of early Egyptian civilization that demands a significant rethinking of how we assume knowledge moved through ancient societies. It means that architectural knowledge was being actively shared across regions during the very earliest centuries of the Egyptian state. It means that builders in different parts of the country were communicating ideas, refining structural techniques, and experimenting with engineering solutions in parallel, not in isolation from one another. The Jabal al-Tair Plateau, researchers now believe, may have functioned as a center of architectural experimentation that was developing simultaneously alongside the great royal cemeteries of Upper Egypt, with builders at this provincial site testing and developing structural solutions that would eventually find their fullest expression in the grand construction programs of the royal court during the Third Dynasty. If you're finding this as fascinating as we do, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover stories like this one, and there are few stories in modern archaeology more worth discovering. Now, let us talk about what else was found at this site, because the two early dynastic tombs were just the most dramatic part of what turned out to be an extraordinarily rich and layered archaeological record. The excavation at Jabal al-Tair also uncovered a pre-dynastic cemetery in the lower stratigraphic layers surrounding the main structures. These were burials from an even earlier period, from the farming and pastoral communities of the Nile Valley who lived in the centuries before Egypt was even politically unified as a single territorial state. Some of these ancient individuals were interred inside wooden coffins, the organic remnants of which survived despite significant deterioration over thousands of years. Their presence at the site tells us something important and quietly profound about the place itself. Jabal al-Tair was not simply a burial ground for one civilization, one dynasty, or one era of history. It was a sacred landscape that multiple, distinct communities chose to return to across vast stretches of time, adapting and building on top of what had come before them. Each group weaving its own funerary traditions into a place that had already been considered sacred ground by the people who had stood there generations earlier. Archaeologists also identified burials from Egypt's late period, a much later historical era extending from roughly 664 to 332 BC, alongside the early dynastic and pre-dynastic remains. Both individual graves and collective burials were documented, and several still contained identifiable remains of wooden coffins. This layering of history at a single site, what researchers have described as an archaeological palimpsest, means that Jabal al-Tair functioned as a continuously active burial location for more than 2,000 years of documented Egyptian history. Each cultural community that came to this elevated plateau above the Nile left its particular mark on how the dead were honored and treated, and each group built, sometimes literally in physical stone, on the foundations laid by those who had lived and died there before them. The site also yielded significant quantities of ceramic materials and organic deposits recovered from inside the funerary shafts themselves. The stone blocks that remain in their original positions within the two main early dynastic tombs are currently undergoing photogrammetric surveying, a precise technical process that uses systematic overlapping photography combined with sophisticated computational modeling to generate accurate, detailed three-dimensional digital reconstructions of the original architectural arrangement. This means that even as the physical excavation work continues to expand across the site, researchers are simultaneously building a comprehensive digital archive of every surviving stone face, every structural joint, and every preserved architectural detail of these 5,000-year-old walls, creating a permanent and fully accessible scientific record that can be studied, measured, digitally modeled, and carefully analyzed by researchers working anywhere in the world for decades and potentially centuries to come. What is also striking about the Jabal al-Tair discovery is its geographical location within Egypt. Minya Governorate sits in central Egypt, well outside the famous and heavily excavated archaeological zones of Giza in the north, Saqqara near Cairo, or the great temple and tomb complexes of Luxor in the Valley of the Kings in Upper Egypt. The fact that tombs exhibiting this level of architectural sophistication and this degree of structural intentionality were discovered in a provincial location rather than in one of the established royal or administrative centers is forcing archaeologists to significantly expand their conceptual map of where the real intellectual and engineering activity of early dynastic Egypt was actually taking place. The old assumption that all the important architectural thinking of the earliest dynasties was concentrated in royal centers and filtered outward from there no longer holds up cleanly against the evidence. The tomb of King Den at Abydos, to which the Jabal al-Tair structures bear such a close architectural resemblance, is itself among the most intensively studied early royal burial complexes in Egyptian archaeology. Den was the fourth or fifth ruler of the first dynasty, and his tomb is particularly notable for introducing several architectural features that were entirely new at the time of its construction, including a staircase entrance that allowed access to the burial chamber. After the initial construction was complete, and more elaborate and carefully planned internal chamber arrangements than had appeared in earlier royal burials. The structural similarity between Den's royal tomb and the provincial Jabal al-Tair structures raises questions that archaeologists are still actively working to answer. Were provincial builders consciously and deliberately imitating royal burial architecture, drawing prestige and structural ideas downward from the royal court? Or was the exchange of architectural knowledge flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, with genuine innovations emerging at different points across the country rather than only filtering from the top of Egyptian society downward? Either answer, if confirmed by future research, would be remarkable in what it reveals about early Egyptian civilization. The first answer would tell us that the symbolic authority and cultural prestige of royal burial architecture was already powerful enough in the very first centuries of Egyptian statehood to inspire deliberate imitation across long distances, meaning that provincial builders were already deeply invested in the cultural world of the pharaonic court, even before that court had fully consolidated its power. The second answer would tell us something even more surprising, that the Egyptian engineering tradition that eventually produced the pyramids was a genuinely collaborative and geographically distributed achievement, not the product of a single centralized genius or a single royal workshop, but the result of a civilization-wide process of experimentation, lateral communication, and cumulative refinement that was happening at multiple nodes across the landscape at the same time. Egypt's Minister of Tourism and Antiquities, Sherif Fathi, emphasized in his official public statement that the evidence being extracted from the Jabal al-Tair site will allow researchers to trace with greater precision than has ever before been possible the developmental roadmap of architectural thinking as it was applied to mortuary and funerary spaces across different eras of Egyptian history. He described the discovery as providing what he called a diachronic perspective, a view that cuts meaningfully across long stretches of time, connecting the simplest and most elementary burial practices of prehistoric Nile Valley communities with the complex, massive, highly organized construction programs of the great royal necropolises that followed centuries later. In plain language, what was found at Jabal al-Tair is a missing chapter in the story of how human beings first learned to build permanent monumental structures. And that chapter was lying buried under desert rock and sand for 5,000 years, waiting for someone with the right tools, the right training, and the right questions to finally bring it back to the surface. The oxidation lines preserved in the surviving sections of the first Jabal al-Tair tomb are also providing clues about practical construction methods that researchers have rarely been able to document in such early structures. These lines, subtle chemical traces left in stone by the prolonged contact of ancient wood, organic material, or metal tools, allow archaeologists to begin reconstructing, in patient and careful detail, the actual physical process of how these builders worked, where exactly they made their stone cuts, how they moved and positioned heavy stone blocks, what kinds of organic reinforcements they inserted into the walls to provide additional structural stability while the tomb was still under construction. The identification of wooden reinforcements embedded within these ancient stone walls is particularly significant because it tells us that early dynastic builders were already working with a sophisticated understanding of composite construction, using stone and organic materials in deliberate and complementary combination rather than simply stacking one type of material on top of another and hoping the whole thing would hold together through sheer mass. Excavations at Jabal al-Tair are actively continuing. The team from the Supreme Council of Antiquities is still in the field, carefully extracting and methodically recording every piece of recovered ceramic, every fragment of surviving organic material, every measurable detail of these ancient structures as they emerge from the earth. Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has stated publicly and explicitly that the site still holds many unanswered questions about the earliest period of Egyptian civilization's architectural development, and that further significant discoveries are fully expected as the excavation continues to expand and deepen across the plateau. What has already been found is more than sufficient to shift the conversation in a meaningful direction. The two early dynastic tombs at Jabal al-Tair are not simply interesting additions to Egypt's already immense and well-documented archaeological record. They are physical, structural evidence, built in stone, preserved by desert conditions, and confirmed by multiple independent archaeological experts that the engineering principles underlying the pyramids were being actively developed, deliberately tested and thoughtfully refined far earlier than the existing historical consensus had suggested, and far more widely across the Egyptian landscape than anyone had previously assumed. The pyramid was not a sudden invention. It was not the product of a single stroke of royal genius or a single moment of architectural inspiration. It was a conclusion, the culmination of a long, slow distributed, multi-generational process of human beings in different parts of a young and rapidly developing civilization working out together through patient experimentation and accumulated experience exactly how to build something that would stand not for years or decades, but for thousands of years. And the people who built these quiet, unassuming tombs above the Nile in Minya 5,000 years ago were a part of that process. They were part of the answer to the question that every single person who has ever stood at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza has silently and instinctively asked, the question of how a civilization without modern machinery, without computers, without steel or concrete, could have possibly figured out how to build something so perfectly engineered that it still stands today in essentially the same condition it was in the day the last stone was set in place. They knew because people like the builders of Jabal al-Tayr spent generations, quiet, unrecorded provincial generations, patiently and methodically figuring it out. One tomb, one wall, one tapered stone at a time. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss a discovery like this one. Egypt is still giving up its secrets, and the stories coming out of the ground right now are among the most extraordinary in the history of archaeology. The desert kept this particular secret for 5 millennia. It does not keep secrets forever. The story of the pyramids has always been told as a story about kings, about power, about the divine authority of the pharaoh, and the vast human labor that authority could command and direct. And while none of that is wrong, the pyramids genuinely were built by the command of rulers who considered themselves gods on earth, using the organized labor of tens of thousands of workers. The Jabal al-Tayr discovery quietly and insistently asks us to add another dimension to that story, the dimension of collective knowledge, the dimension of distributed experimentation, the dimension of ordinary people and provincial builders who were working on the same fundamental structural problems as the royal architects, often far from the centers of political power, and whose accumulated insights fed into the great tradition of Egyptian monumental construction, just as surely as the decisions made in the royal court. That matters because it changes how we understand not just ancient Egypt, but the nature of architectural progress itself. The pyramids did not emerge from nowhere. They grew slowly and unevenly from a long tradition of accumulated structural knowledge that was being developed across the full breadth of Egyptian civilization, in famous sites and in obscure ones, in royal burial grounds and in provincial cemeteries that most people today have never heard of. When we look at Jabal al-Tayr, we are looking at something that history almost forgot entirely. A site that survived not because it was famous or powerful, but simply because the desert preserved it, because the stone held. And in doing so, it preserved a piece of the answer to one of the oldest questions in human history, the question of how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. The answer, as it turns out, is longer and more distributed and more deeply human than we ever suspected. And it was waiting all along in the walls of 2 modest burial structures on the eastern bank of the Nile, in a country where the earth is still telling stories that the world is only beginning to hear. There is one more thing worth noting before we close this story. The ongoing excavation at Jabal al-Tayr is not finished. What has been announced publicly so far represents the first significant wave of findings from a site that researchers believe still holds considerably more to offer. The photogrammetric surveys are still being processed. The ceramic analysis is still ongoing, and the broader plateau has not been fully mapped or excavated. What we know today is only the opening chapter of a much longer story about this site and about the deep structural roots of one of humanity's greatest architectural traditions. The history of archaeology is full of moments where a single unexpected find forced a fundamental revision of what we believed about an ancient civilization. Jabal al-Tayr now belongs to that list, not because of gold or treasure, there was none found here, but because of what the structure of those ancient walls tells us about the minds of the people who built them and about the civilization they were quietly helping to create. 5,000 years ago, somewhere above the eastern bank of the Nile in central Egypt, a group of builders sat down and worked out a problem. They needed to build a structure that would stand, that would not collapse, that would protect the dead and honor their memory across time. And in working out that problem, in deciding for reasons that felt practical and perhaps intuitive to them at the time, to make the walls thicker at the base and let them taper gently upward, they arrived, without knowing it, at one of the foundational insights of monumental architecture. An insight that would, in the end, be refined and amplified and finally expressed in its most dramatic and lasting form in the shape of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the most recognized human-made structure on the surface of the earth. Still standing, still astonishing. And now, thanks to the work being done in Minya, a little better understood.